I have the pleasure and honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Janusz Reykowski, to you. And the pleasure is the greatest for me because I must say that I have known Janusz since 1981, since early in 1981. And I would like to briefly switch away from his slides, which are, of course, more important, but I prepared a few slides that characterize Janusz and what we did together. As usual, of course, a little about Janusz's academic career. He had his PhD in 1959 from Warsaw University. In 1965 came the typical second academic degree that in many Central, Eastern, Northern European countries we have to become eligible to become professor. Then in 1972 he became associate, and 1979 full professor. 1980 he was the co-founder of and head of the Institute of Psychology at the Polish Academy of Sciences. And in 1996 he also co-founded this institution. He was always a founder in that sense. He had hard-to-count visiting appointments abroad in the United States, in Germany, and in many places. I'm not going through that. Do it this way. He had also many positions, and he was president of the International Society of Political Psychology. He was in governing bodies of the International Society for the Study of Behavioral Development, the European Association of Psychology of Personality, and he's a member of the Academia Europaea and several other, and he received the Neville Sanford Award of the International Society for Political Psychology. So he is a celebrity, but that is not because he is a title collector, but he has always been a doer. He's also a political person. Janusz lived what we had been demanding at this conference from all of us, namely active in the political sphere. Do, as a psychologist, take part in political activities. It was demanded from all of us. Not many have really done that. But he was, for example, the co-chair on behalf of the Polish government at the round table in the late 1980s of the Committee on Political Reforms. And he was one of the guarantors of the peaceful transition from the old to the new era. I think this cannot be held in, well, I don't even find words. I think this is a very important point of Janusz's biography. And then finally, you might want to ask, is he a cross-culturalist? And this is a bit embarrassing because I put myself there also. Yes, he's also cross-culturalist. He has a publication in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology from 1989. And without much further ado, Janusz, I would like you to take the microphone away from me and give us your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus, for your nice words. It is when you hear such a nice words, it is kind of burden, it's kind of responsibility. Audience may expect something exceptional, and so this is very, very difficult to hear this kind of things. I have also another problem with this talk. When Paweł Boehnke invited me to this talk, I was surprised because I am not a cross-cultural psychologist. I have no experience in this field. But he persuaded me that since I'm a political psychologist, there are some similarities or some correspondence between these two fields. So maybe this is what political psychologists can tell is something that may be, to some extent, interested for cross-cultural psychologists. Let me start with such a statement. From the very early stages of human history, over millennia, social groups were adapting to their environment, not only by utilization of resources available in their nature, but also by utilization of other people. Conquest, plundering, enslavement were the typical way of obtaining the means of survival, but also the ways of obtaining increasing wealth, power, status, and prestige. In other words, violence had played a major role in human societies. If we, it is not mere interpersonal violence. It was a way the life of whole societies was set. In other words, it was societal violence. Let me first mention various functions of societal violence. Violence was important both in small-scale societies and tribal system and large-scale one, large state organizations. Groups were using force in order to increase or defend their possessions, territories, material resources, and so on, but also to obtain labor. Military success was also the main source of wealth, both capital, land primarily, and labor, farmers, craftsmen. The prey of war were also women. Nomad tribes accumulated wealth by looting and plundering other societies. But violence was also a means of enrichment in more advanced societies. For example, there is thousands or millions of such examples. Let me just mention one. England between 1455 and 1485 in England, 7 dukes, 9 earls, and 19 lords were killed in action or beheaded after battles. Losers were deprived of titles and lands. Their estates were distributed among winners. Violence and physical dominance was the basic social structure. Conquerors became aristocracy, conquered were turned into the slaves, serfs, and so on. Violence also a very important factor in protection of group cohesion. In traditional societies, group identity were reinforced by the magical or religious ceremonies. Human sacrifices could be the important part of these ceremonies. Prisoners of war were typical sacrifices. Cruel and severe punishment of dissenters and law-breaking peoples was also directed toward protection of cohesion. But the methods was buried at stakes, crucifying. It was a typical punishment in Roman Empire. Common use of torture. I learned some time ago that in Poland, in the Middle Ages, there was about 12 torture chambers in different states and different cities and places in Poland. Violence was a means of socialization of young children And killing and abusing people was an entertainment for people. Not only in Roman circus, but also, for example, in public executions. However, the chaotic, unrestrained in-group violence is threatening to the very existence of the group or society. Human societies have developed various means of control of in-group violence. Group leader, these measures of control was of different kind. Group leaders or authority were responsible for peace within groups. Elaborated normative systems restricted violence. It was in Hammurabi Code, in Ten Commandments, in early Roman laws, in all these written normative systems, there are specific rules concerning violence, especially killing and harming other people. Religious teaching also established rules of using violence, supported by the expectation of supernatural sanctions. The norms regulating in-group violence were not applicable to out-group violence. This was a completely different situation. But one important factor that has also a role in preventing violence, or to some extent, was social hierarchy. Social system of traditional societies was based on well-established social hierarchies. Position in the hierarchy depended primarily on birth. In feudal Europe, it was a common belief that hierarchy was determined by God and cannot be questioned. Some changes could be introduced due to the martial accomplishment, but basically hierarchy was interpreted as stable. The hierarchy reduces conflict between people if it unequivocally defines access to resources, to prestige, relation of control. One may say that over the long historical process, the attitudes toward violence were changing. The major changes consist in alteration of societal attitudes concerning military conflicts, such as diminishing acceptance of war, especially as a means of acquisition of territory and natural gains. Establishment of civic rules of welfare, the rights of prisoners of war, protection of civilians, and so on. Prohibition of forced labor, protection of rights of prisoners, condemnation of torture and capital punishment, establishing the right of women and children, delegitimation of physical force, violence as a method of dealing with political conflicts. Let me bring here one illustration of the change. It is from Pinker books, who shows the decline of homicide rate in Western Europe. And he's saying that between 1200 and 2000, we can observe systematic decline in homicide rates. The evolution of the role of violence in social life was related to several interrelated processes. Pinker, again, describes, referring to the German author Elias, he described it as civilizing process, development of social norm of self-control. The very important factor of the change was the development of liberal ideology and policy. Liberal philosophical doctrine of liberation gradually got to transform into political doctrine that became the basis of the broad consensus on the proposition that individual freedom is the fundamental principle of social organization. Another factor is development of liberal culture and liberal set of minds, liberal mentality. And last not least, development of liberal institutions based on the principle of individual freedom, free market, and democracy. The evolution of violence in social life was the development of cultural liberal ideology was associated with transformation of self-structure, from embedded self to autonomous self. Embedded self apparently got along without privacy and could not exist apart from his or her position in society. Emerging self as a separated autonomous individual emphasized on the unique individual destiny and potential of each person. The development of liberal institution democracy seems to be political precondition of implementation of liberal values. Liberal democracy delegitimized naked force as a means of realization of political goals, of enrichment, of prestige, of way of dealing with ideological or other conflicts. Political competition within the democratic institution was supposed to replace the violent struggle for power. Democratic authority possessed the sole authorization for using force, but it might use it only for protection of law or to defend of the vital interest of the state. This authority must be controlled by independent institutions in order to make sure that it is within the boundaries of defined law. The development of liberal institutions such as free market was economic precondition of protection of the liberal values. Free market is based on the principle of freedom of individuals who freely participate in economic exchange and economic competition. The wealth and prestige are supposed to be the result of success in free market economic activity. The use of direct physical force is prohibited. Economic competition within the market institutions is supposed to replace the violent struggles for wealth. Liberal culture and liberal institutions were supposed to eliminate societal violence, but in contemporary democratic societies, various forms of violence, physical and not physical, are used in service of political, economic, and ideological goals. First of all, there is extensive use of non-physical forms of violence. Political coercion, using political power for elimination of political adversaries from public life, for restraining their rights, for mobilization hostile attitudes against particular societal groups. Economic coercion that consists in using economic power to enforcement economic advantages from weaker partners, from workers, suppliers, business associates, and so on. Symbolic violence in media, in virtual space, destroying political, economic, or ideological opponents by means of character assassination, false accusation, symbolic lynches in the internet. Cyber attacks is the new, very dangerous form of violence. But there is also physical violence. There exists in democratic countries political groups or movements inimical toward democracy, glorifying violence against minorities, immigrants, political adversaries, and attacking them physically. Growing popularity of such movement, we observe growing popularity of such a movement in Europe, also outside of Europe. But last but not least are military conflict or wars conducted by democratic countries in various parts of the world. While they are initially justified by humanistic concerns, they quite often tend to aggravate existing conflicts and result in great human and material loss. Liberals are fundamentally against violence in dealing with societal problems. Nevertheless, liberal societies, based on the principle of freedom and equality, may engender processes that are conducive to violence. These processes might have various causes, socio-political, such like imperfection of democracy and market system, but also ideological and psychological. Let me focus in this talk on the last two factors, namely psychological and social. First, let me say that in contemporary liberal societies, there are ideological and psychological differences in attitude toward violence. They are related to difference in mentality. The term mentality refers here to the system of implicit normative assumption, expectations, and beliefs manifested in the ways of thinking, in ideological orientation, in worldview, in social attitudes. In contemporary world, liberal culture and liberal mentality coexist with traditional culture and traditional mentality. There are various differences between liberal and traditional mentalities. I will discuss the differences in values and in moral thinking as the most relevant to attitude to the violence. First about personal values. In a number of studies, researchers have found systematic differences in values between people who classify themselves as liberals and as conservatives, or left and right. Many studies of this kind are based on, I think, in this group well-known theory of Schwartz, theory of basic values. According to these theories, we know value guide people's judgment, what is good and what is justified or bad, illegitimate, and so on. The theory identified 10 basic values that are recognized across culture. Let me bring one of the studies that illustrates the thesis that I want to put forth. Participants from 20 countries were asked themselves to put themselves on 11-point scale of left and right, or liberal and conservatives. These two dimensions are quite often mixed to describe their political orientation, and to report on 6-point scale similarity to 23 verbal portraits of person described in terms of or her values and aspirations. On this basis, they made characteristics of differences in terms of defining goals. Liberals were higher than conservatives on the value of universalism, that is understanding, appreciation, tolerance, protection for welfare. But conservatives were higher from liberals on the value of conformity, on the value of security, on the value of tradition. Those, the main value differences between liberal and traditional mentality concern the anchoring point of value judgment. For conservatives, it is well-being of particular social groups. For such like family, nation, ethnic groups. For liberal, it is an individual in general, both in and out groups. Let us compare now moral judgment. Relations between ideological orientation and moral judgment has been extensively studied within the framework of moral foundation theory. In the last decade, this theory is of morality based on existence cross-cultural, of extensive cross-cultural studies has become very popular. The theory is based on the proposition that there are two kinds of moral system. One is suppressing selfishness by protecting individual. It is, as they say, individualizing approach. The other kinds of moral system try to suppress selfishness by strengthening groups and institutions that are binding individual into roles and duties. The first system is related to widespread concern about fairness, reciprocity, and justice, and about caring, nurturing, and protecting vulnerable individuals. These two orientations were labeled fairness and reciprocity, and harm care. The second system entails values related to relation between individual and the group. Those are in-group loyalty, authority respect, purity, sanctity. Haidt and co-workers examined the morality of liberals and conservatives. The following figure shows foundation scores as a function of self-rated political identity. As you can see, here are these two individualizing values, harm and fairness. This, among strongly liberals, they are very high. Among strongly conservatives, they are pretty low. But among strongly conservatives, there are very important values: in-group, authority, purity or sanctity. But the same values are quite less respected by people with liberal orientations. The authors conclude the negative slope of harm and fairness means that conservatives rated these issues as less relevant to their moral judgments. Conversely, the positive slopes for in-group authority and purity means that conservatives rated these issues as more relevant to their moral judgment. It should be noted, however, the difference between liberals and conservatives were neither binary nor absolute. In fact, while strongly liberals rated binding foundation, in-group authority and purity as rather not very relevant to their moral judgment. Strong conservatives regarded harm and fairness as important for their moral judgment. Value and moral differences between people who define themselves as liberals or conservatives indicate that there is a common feature of these differences. The value of moral judgment of conservatives seems to be anchored on the conviction that primary moral obligation is protection of the group, subservience to its norm, authorities, and traditions. The value of moral judgment of liberals at the other side is anchored in the conviction that protection of the individual rights and individual freedoms is the primary of moral obligation. Nevertheless, this difference has important implications for the beliefs about the role and legitimacy of violence. To illustrate this, let me show the research of Krystyna Skarżyńska from Poland, who was studying relationship between moral foundation and attitude toward aggression. You may see that harm, care, and fairness, this individualizing foundation had, especially harm care, had negative relation with aggression approval and aggression politics, positive relation to liberal democracy. Okay, thank you for your help. The in-group loyalty, authority, and purity sanctity had, especially in-group loyalty, was related to approval of aggression, approval of aggression politics, but not much approval for liberal democracy. With other blue figures, there is similar situation. Attitudes toward war and peace. In the study of large group of general population, it has been found that the most approving of wars were conservatives. In 9-point scale, they had 7.03. Moderates, average. Liberals were opposed. Conservatives, more punitive than liberals. For example, McCown Pellets found that conservatives had greater support for harsh punishment, approval for capital punishment. Let me quote here the person who is one of the very popular American publicists in conservative circles, who in her books, Godless, the Church of Liberalism, expressed the attitude not in scientific terms, but in terms of practical relationship. She writes, for example, about capital punishment. This is a deliberative sign and of an advanced civilization protecting itself from predators. If anything, modern execution methods are too humane. Or about criminal confession. The court completely eviscerated criminal confession because of the myth that people constantly confessing of crimes they didn't count. And there is another example here. I wanted just to bring you the concrete examples how it looks in conservative thinking. Why conservatives are more punitive than liberals? As a conclusion of the study on two independent samples by Sylvia Sibyl, they found that group-oriented moral concern conservative orientation elicit higher level of punitiveness by promoting a view that crime is being perpetrated against society. Individual-oriented moral concern reduces punitiveness by directing attention towards the welfare of offenders as well. Recapitulation. There are systematic differences between conservatives and liberals' ideology in values and foundations of moral judgment. The differences consist in implicit normative assumption regarding either individual or group as the main frame of reference of values and morality. These differences have implication for attitudes toward violence, but the relation between ideology and violence seems to be more complex than I described now. There are various kinds of conservatism. Many studies of ideological differences have been based on the assumption that socio-political opinions and attitudes can be conceptualized as measured on one dimension, described as liberalism and conservatism, or left or right. Referring to various research, Duckett, a New Zealand psychologist, has argued that these attitudes refer to difference between conservative and liberal orientation are organized along two distinct dimensions, not one. One is right-wing authoritarianism, and the second is social dominance orientation. They are regarded as attitudinal expression of two basic and a very different set of social values. Right-wing authoritarianism is expression of the broad motivational goal or value of collective security, which arises from social threats and insecurity in general by favoring obedient support for existing social authorities, coercive social control, conforming to the traditional moral and religious norms. High in right-wing authoritarianism are particularly negative to outgroups that seem to threaten collective security, to groups members who are different from the majority, to dissident groups, protesters, feminist guys, and so on. High RWA prefer right-wing parties, emphasize law and order, defend traditional and religious values, correlates with view that social world as dangerous and threatening place. Social dominance orientation believes in social economic inequality and the rights of powerful groups to dominate weaker ones. Stems from the social worldview believes that the world is ruthlessly competitive jungle in which might is right and the strong win and the weak lose. Value of motivational goals is dominance and superiority over others. Lack of empathy, restless pursuit of power, and self-interested goals. Social dominance orientation belief in economic inequality and the right of powerful group to dominate weaker one. Values or motivation goals are power dominance and superiority. Political preferences. Right-wing parties that emphasize free market capitalism and anti-welfare politics promote the maintain group dominance, superiority, and inequality. Idea American first is an example of these attitudes. You can see that this idea is illustrated, it shows in different countries of Europe, including President Trump. And the authors put here, as you may notice, you can see that Hitler is getting up from his grave. He says, "I can't live with so much noise." Relation between RWA and SDO, let me say it short, there are various relations. For example, studies in Western Europe have reported strong positive correlation between these two variables. North America, weak positive or non-significant correlation. Central Eastern Europe, largely ex-communist countries, non-significantly or significantly negative correlates. But double highs, high RW and SDO, express at the high level of prejudice, support right-wing conservative political parties, both high RWA and high SDO might condone violence. There is important finding in social psychology that can be summarized in the statement. RW tends to increase in condition of threat. Jost and others, summarizing large body of research on psychological basis of political orientation, concluded that there is a fairly natural correspondence between needs to manage uncertainty and threat and values of political conservatism. Decade later, Onret and Van Hiel and others, in 2013, presented the result of the study on sample 97 nations, comparing country-level indicators of threat and indicators of right-wing attitudes for each of these countries. They found positive relationship between threat indicators and right-wing attitudes. The same Jost, who came to conclusion that exposure to objectively threatening situation, such as terrorist attack, major change in racial demography, and similar, is associated with conservative shifts. On this figure, they show the relationship between levels of threat and economic hierarchical right-wing orientation. The relationship between right-wing and conservatism as threat is confirmed in a number of experimental or quasi-experimental studies in various countries of the Western world. I will omit this specific characteristic because they say all the same. There are, however, the caveat, important, namely existential threat intensify the existing ideological orientation. Namely, conservatives becomes more conservative and liberals more liberals. In other words, the existing attitudes become more extreme. Problem, how it's happened that why the conservative shift is such a popular, and one hypothesis is that people have latent, as many people have latent dangerous world belief. Let me omit this, but I describe you two forms of conservative ideology, radical forms of conservative ideology. But there is also another form of conservative mentality and ideology that does not condone violence. That call it traditionalism, favoring traditional or fashioned lifestyle, behavioral norms and values, ethnocentric identification, religiosity, and religious fundamentalism. Let me stress this. It would be not true how, in spite of the fact that many people think this way, that conservatives are automatically for violence, for right-wing authoritarians and so on. Just short example. Study in US, Israel, New Zealand shows that I am comparing here, okay. Must be cautious not to. I will not use the red points, but I may again. You can see that in religiosity in US, traditionalists are higher than authoritarians. The same in Israel, the same in New Zealand. But use of nuclear weapons is different. Authoritarian US positive, traditionalist negative. In Israel, authoritarian positive, Israel might be neutral. Greater military force, the same phenomenon. In other words, what I want to say is that there is form of conservatism that does not, that is different from authoritarians or social dominance. Let me conclude this part. That the state of mind can be, this state of mind, radical conservatives, can be transformed in kind of civil religion in which sacrifice for the group is a fundamental moral obligation. Marvin and Engel in their recent book, not recent, in their book, wrote, blood sacrifice preserves the nation. The nation is shared memory of blood sacrifice, periodically renewed. Those who share such memories often, but not always, share language, living space, and ethnicity. What they may always share and cultivate is the memory of blood sacrifice. We may conclude that traditional mentality and conservative ideology in situation of perceived threat or high competitive are likely to take a form or intensify right-wing authoritarianism and or social dominance or orientation. This ideological orientation tend to promote societal violence. But there is also some relation between liberal mentality and violence. In fact, liberal mentality is not homogeneous. Liberal ideology can take various forms. Especially, we can differentiate ideology based upon universalistic values, based on self-protection, self-enhancement values, egocentric values. Prosocial form of liberalism may manifest, for example, as identification with all humanity, that is concern and caring for all humans. It was studied by McFarland and his co-workers, and it correlates with expressed support for universal human rights, for human rights organization, for opposition to torture, and so on. Humanitarianism is the similar phenomenon described by Feynman and Steinberg, that people take responsibility toward, have responsibility toward the fellow human beings. Humanism, materialism scale were developed by Boehnke that differentiate prosocial involvement in public affairs and treating human beings as autonomous values versus concentration on money and instrumental treatment of other people. There is also an egocentric form of liberalism. The extreme form of liberal idea or of primacy of individual. Let me quote here Ayn Rand. It is a person who has a great prestige among American rights. Even, for example, Ron Paul, one of the leading Republican politicians, regard Ayn Rand as her guru. According to Ayn Rand, philosopher, writer, and guru of American rights, every man is end in himself, not the means for the end of others. He must exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others, not sacrificing others to himself. The pursuit of his own rational self-interest and his own happiness is the highest moral principle of the life. These assumptions are the basis of libertarianism that downplays democracy and equality. Libertarian society is therefore a set of individuals focused on maximization of their own goods, the social bonds and social responsibilities, except contractual, are not important. It is likely engender high level, this society engender high level of alienation. One of the characteristics of this is materialistic orientation that I think I don't have time to describe. Such a materialistic orientation is associated with the social dominance orientation based on the competitive jungle belief. People with high SDO are not likely to care about harming others, as I thought before. They value power, achievement, and hedonism. They are based on the ideology of social Darwinism, based on the principle survival of the fittest. With increasing this situation that produce high level of alienation in society, in contemporary societies. The Mental Health Foundation in the United Kingdom showed that in modern market-oriented societies, less value is attributed to relationship and feelings of isolation and loneliness acts are increasing. Alteration of social Darwinism ideology, alienation and social Darwinism ideology may give rise to violence. Conclusion. I was arguing that societal violence, that a pervasive phenomenon in traditional societies, has been in long historical process transformed and reduced. Human societies have developed various means of controlling it. Relatively, the most successful means of controlling the violence were developed within the societies organized on the basis of liberal democracy and free market. Liberal ideology of individual freedom and human rights constitute the moral and political basis of these systems. But in spite of the historical progress in reducing societal violence, as argued by Steven Pinker, the various forms play still a significant role in the life of these societies. Even more, there are periods of time when social violence tends to increase and attain extreme forms. In the 21st century, societal violence becomes again more common and more acceptable. In this talk, I wanted to focus your attention on two kinds of social psychological processes that might be responsible by weakening the societal forces controlling violence. One such a process is related to the very nature of the progress of individuation, emancipation of individual. There is an important adverse effect of this progress. The extreme individualism with its ideology of self-contained individual. The ideology contributes to deterioration of human relations and brings about dangerous social and psychological consequences. The social consequences are related to widespread feeling of anomie and discontent with the social system. The psychological consequences of extreme individuation are manifest in the form of endemic stress. The direct sources of the stress is tough competition, money problems, impaired human relation, frustration of the basic need to belong. The weakening of societal forces controlling violence may result also in changes in traditional mentality, manifested in the form of increasing right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation that may foster violent approach to social problem. These changes are evoked by social threat, a competitive social environment. I must add that the violence may also originate as a consequence of social inequality, sense of deprivation and injustice of the social system. On this background, left-wing authoritarianism is likely to develop. I had no time to discuss this issue in my talk. As we know, there are various mega problems of contemporary world, such as globalization, climate change, environment, demography, South-North imbalance, and so on, that require cooperative effort of world leaders and nations. Large-scale disasters may happen if the belief that the violence is a legitimate form of dealing with human problems become popular again. Thank you.